Up here in memory of Lisa Stevenson. It's hard to believe it's been a year, but just beautiful flowers, beautiful lady. We're continuing in our study of the book of Numbers, and the first 17 chapters, as we looked at last week, really recounted a series of rebellions. The difficult time in the desert, really the first 2 years, which caused a lot of rebellions, a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of complaints. First, Moses' sister and brother conspired against him, used his wife as a pretext for trying to undermine his authority and grab their share of the power. Then Israel complained about hardships, and it seemed to have originated with the so-called mixed multitude that accompanied Israel out of Egypt, but it spread to all the people. Then there was just general complaint about the food. They wanted meat to eat. We're sick and tired of manna. We've got to have something better. That threatened to turn into a full-scale riot. They were standing as families outside their tents, lamenting, which means wailing as loud as they could, signaling their dissatisfaction. That was followed by the command to enter the land of Canaan. And they said, we need some spies to go look at it first. They had some doubts. So Moses, with God's permission, sent spies. The spies came back and said, we don't think we can take them. Very powerful people. They're tall and big, and the cities are well fortified. And at this point, there was a full-scale rebellion. They gathered around Moses and Aaron, had rocks in their hands. They were preparing to stone them, select new leaders, and go back to Egypt. Just fear made them panic and go almost insane. That was followed by a group of leaders. There was a man named Korah, a leader of the Levites, 250 fellow Levite leaders, 2 other men from the tribe of Reuben. They all challenged Moses and Aaron and said, we need to have a share of the leadership. And that caused a great crisis, and we saw the results of Korah's rebellion, where the ground swallowed up, fire came down and consumed 250 people. But one complaint, one rebellion after another, because of the hardships, because of the difficulties of life in the desert. And it's easy for us to judge them, but we're not in the desert in the way they were. Most of us spend some time in a desert, a spiritual desert, and it's easy to complain, it's easy to turn on God, to turn on other people, to blame someone else, to try to find a way out. And that's what they were doing. But all of those rebellions finally ended when Moses was told by God, collect a staff from the leader of each one of the 12 tribes, and then get Levi's staff. Big stick. We know what a staff is. Lay those before me in the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and I will show you who is my choice. And he chose Aaron's staff, and it budded, and it bore flowers, and it had fruit. A full year's growth in one night. A miraculous sign of growth that ended all of those rebellions. So now we're looking at 3 essentially transitional chapters. But a lot of important things happen in them. Chapter 18 puts an end to the story of the Levites, their dissatisfaction, their belief that they should be able to serve as priests, as well as just Aaron's family. Chapter 18 details exactly what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to get for what they do. Very clear, almost contractual kind of language there. And they are told, this is what you do, and if you don't do this, you will bear your iniquity. And that's kind of an ambiguous phrase. What does that mean? Most commentators say it means, at this point, it's up to you. The ball's in your court. Don't mess this up. This is what you're supposed to do it. Then they were told, you have rights. You are to receive 10%, a tithe, from all the other tribes. If each person in each tribe gives 10% to one tribe, the Levites, they're doing pretty well, right? So that's a wonderful gift. But then they're told, you in turn are to take 10% of what you get and give that to Aaron's family. That was God's economy. We receive and we give. But this may be a good time to say a word about tithing. Sometimes we hear people talk about tithing. They use the word tithe. And sometimes we get scholarly and say, well, actually, there's not a tithe in the New Testament, which is true. We're never commanded to give 10% as a tithe. But the language of tithing doesn't bother me so much for this reason. Tithe carries a sense of an obligation that you plan to give. You're obligated to give. And if we place everything in the category of free will offering, the danger there is we think, well, that means anything left over. I spend all I can spend on what I want. If there's anything over, I can hand it to God. Well, that word tithe eliminates that. It has the idea of an obligation attached to it. We all know there is no command in the New Testament to give 10%. So if you understand tithe as 10% as a command of God, that's not in the New Testament. But that practice and that example of planning to give and knowing how much you're going to give and setting aside to give that, that's a very, very biblical concept. So they were to receive, and not just whatever the other tribes felt like giving them. They were to receive 10%. And they weren't just to give the Levites whatever they wanted to, whatever they thought they had left over. They were to plan to give them a certain amount. I think God loves planning in our financial matters as well as in others. As we love to say in service, many ways to give and to give back. We can't all give the same thing, but planning to give is important. That's chapter 18. Chapter 20 deals with the passing of leadership. It's right before they go into the promised land. We're told at the beginning of chapter 20 that Miriam dies in Kadesh Barnea, the only woman we're told about her death in all of the Pentateuch, their sister. Then Moses himself disobeys God. He's been so strong all of this time. He finally gets fed up. He has a temper tantrum. He disobeys God. And God says, well, for that reason, you won't be able to enter the promised land. The penalty for disobedience for the others were they could not enter. You disobeyed, you can't enter either. That's not to say that Moses is not one of the great figures of Scripture. He is. Look at the Mount of Transfiguration. But he had to pay that penalty, could not enter. Then at the end of that chapter, we also read about Aaron dying at the edge of the border with Edom. Right before they begin the entry, Aaron dies. So that whole family, Miriam, Moses, Aaron, either dead or, in a sense, sort of disqualified. So making that transition, new leadership, new people, entry into the land of Canaan. In chapter 21, we see Israel entering the lands right next to the promised land, beginning that process of entering in chapter 21. But this morning, we're going to look at two kind of little-known accounts from those last years of the Exodus. Most of the events in chapters 1 through 17 came from the first 2 or 3 years. And then the end of the book is about the last year or two. Not a whole lot said about the intervening years, but two important things happen. In chapter 19, there's a new sacrifice instituted. It's the sacrifice of the red heifer. And then in chapter 21, there's a strange story, a story about a serpent, a bronze serpent that Moses fashions, puts up on a pole, and it looks suspiciously like an idol. And we're told, don't make any idols. And this looks like an idol. So what are those two stories about? A new sacrifice, which was to take place in a different way, in a different place from any other sacrifice. And this thing that looks like an idol, why is it held up? Seems odd. A scholar now dead named Michael Heiser said some of the most profound truths of the Bible appear in some of the strangest or oddest or out-of-the-way stories. I think that's true here. I think both of the stories we're going to look at today show Jehovah God not just teaching the importance of faith and obedience, which we've seen lesson after lesson in that area. They also showed how God was preparing the imagination, if you will, the mental habits, the way of viewing things for the coming of the Messiah. And in odd, unaccountable ways, we see foreshadowings, pictures of Jesus Christ, shaping the Israelites' understanding of the Messiah who is to come. You know, in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul said that we perceive spiritual things in a mirror dimly, in a glass darkly, depending on your translation. That's all they could see about the Messiah to come. They saw it dimly, but through these two events, God gives them a glimpse into what the Messiah will look like when he comes, what he will do when he comes. Israel had a lot of sacrifices, as we know. Book of Leviticus filled with those. Leviticus 4 details all kinds of sin offerings that different people had to make. Now, the sacrifice of the red heifer, we're told, is a sin offering, but it's completely different from these others. All of these sin offerings in Leviticus 4 are designed for unintentional sins. Sometimes we forget that. But all of those sins are for things you didn't know were wrong when you did it, or you didn't mean to do it. Maybe you told someone a lie when you thought it was the truth. Well, you were still guilty of telling a lie. And you made a sacrifice to be forgiven for that. So those kind of situations. If you touch something with unholy hands, but you didn't know your hands were unholy, then you had to have a sacrifice. You had contaminated, but they were for unintentional sins. If you were a priest, you offered a bull. That's a lot of money. That's like burning your tractor. You know, it was a significant loss. Priests offered a bull. Its blood was drained, sprinkled inside the tent, poured out at the base of the altar. Its fat, selected organs, the kidneys, one lobe of the liver, were burned on the altar. The skin, the flesh, the intestines, all of that, they were taken outside the camp and burned. If you were a priest, a bull. If the whole congregation sinned, I'm not sure how that would exactly happen. The same sacrifice was made. If a leader sinned, you weren't a religious leader, but just a leader, then you sacrificed a male goat in the same way. If just a common person sinned, one of us, you offered a female goat or a lamb. But those were for unintentional sins. Leviticus 6, we see a little bit of discussion about the sacrifices for conscious sins, deliberate sins, a sin you meant to commit when you did it. We read, if you deceived or oppressed your neighbor, that is another Jew, if you bullied them, took advantage of them, charged them too much, tricked them, you had to make a full restitution to the person plus 20%. Then you had to offer a ram, that's a male sheep, without blemish as a guilt offering. So if you deliberately sinned against someone, you had to make it right with God, you had to make it right with the person. A lot of blood, constant shedding of blood. But now God is instituting a new sin offering. It's unique. Let's read about it. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, this is the statute of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the people of Israel to bring you a red heifer. That is, a heifer is a cow that has not given birth. To bring you a red heifer without defect, in which there is no blemish, and on which a yoke has never come. So it's never been used for any other purpose, never worked, no blemish. Later, a rabbi said that the red heifer could not have more than 2 white hairs or 2 black hairs. That was considered a blemish, had to be fully red. I guess we can go with that, whatever they meant by a blemish, also without defect. And you shall give it to Eleazar the priest, and it shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered before him. Let's break this down a little bit. First of all, this was a very rare kind of sacrifice, a red heifer. This is the only sacrifice for which the color was specified. For no other sacrifice did it say the animal must be of this color. That's unusual. Had to be never yoked. Could not be used for anything. Had to have no blemish, no more than 2 white hairs or 2 black hairs. According to rabbinical literature, and just take this with a grain of salt, whatever you think it's worth, there were only 7 red heifers found in Israel history. So they offered this 7 times during the course of history up until the destruction of Jerusalem. It was the only sacrifice that was not offered on the altar. They took the sacrifice outside the camp, and there you slaughtered and sacrificed the animal. This sacrifice is the only one that was not done by a priest. Eleazar the priest oversaw it, but it was killed by someone else in Eleazar's presence. That was unique. Let me see. We'll get to these verses in just a moment. I didn't copy all of these here. If you want to read further, Numbers 19. It was the only sacrifice to be burned in its entirety. Now, these other sacrifices, they would burn the fat, they would burn like the kidneys and a lobe of the liver, they would burn certain things. But then the rest was taken, outside of the camp as refuse and just burned as refuse. This was the only sacrifice to be burned in its entirety. Nothing on the altar, take it out. Now the priest would get his fingers in the blood, and 7 times he would do this towards the tabernacle. But the tabernacle is far away. They're outside the camp. Make that gesture towards the camp. And then they burned everything. Bones, flesh, organs, everything else burned. And it was burned in its entirety. This was a holocaust. Burned it down to the finest ash. Another unique thing. While it was burning, the priest added cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet. There's one other sacrifice that you added those 3 things to the animal being sacrificed, and that was for leprosy. So if you had offered the sacrifice for leprosy, it was a strange sacrifice as well. You took 2 birds, you killed 1 bird, you put the blood of 1 bird on the other bird, then you wrapped that bird in hyssop, cedar wood, and scarlet, and you did that over water so it would all fall into the water, and then you use that water for cleansing. But the same thing for leprosy was used for this sacrifice. Another unique feature, last one. Everyone involved in that sacrifice in some way was unclean until evening. The priest who oversaw the burning, the man who did the slaughter, the guy who gathered the ashes, they're all ceremonially unclean. Somehow just doing that got them unclean in some way. It's called a sin offering. We see that here in at the bottom of verse 9. It is a sin offering. But if you read other places, I didn't try to copy all of this, we're told that it applies perpetually to all Israelites and to all strangers who lived among the Israelites, to be observed by Gentiles and by Jews. That's unique. No other sacrifice applied in that way. What was that all about? Well, the water was used to cleanse people who had come in contact with death. If you touched someone who had died, you were unclean. If you accidentally touched a bone, you were out digging, and you accidentally dug up a bone, a human bone, and touched that, you were unclean. If you went into the tent where someone had died, you were unclean. And this water of cleansing was used to cleanse people from contact with death. And that strikes us again as a kind of an odd concept. I think it makes a little bit of sense if we think further about it. First of all, it was needed. A lot of people died. Somebody tried to calculate how many people on average had to die each day for the whole generation to pass away in 40 years. And it was around between 150, 200 people a day had to die among the Israelites. So there was a lot of death, a lot of contact with death, the burials, the preparations. A lot of people were defiled by death there in the desert. But you had to be purified before you could go into the temple area, before you could offer your own sacrifice for some other reason. Contact with death made you unclean. Well, some people see kind of a rationalistic explanation. There was a fear of disease and germs, so if you touched anything, you had to be unclean, and so it was all about that. But I think there's a lot more going on. Death is the penalty for sin. And God is the God of the living. He's not the God of the dead. Those who had been in contact with death, who were in the same tent where someone who died had been, they were all contaminated by death. It's not the threat of disease. I think it's you've touched death. And God is living. He is the living God. He is the God of the living. There's a profound theology here. That is, death is unnatural. Death is wrong. You can't carry death accidentally or in any way into God's presence. We're told in the New Testament, death is the last enemy to be overcome, but death is the enemy of God. You can't bring God's enemy, death, into his presence. Well, how do we square that with all of these sacrifices? For one thing, animal sacrifices took the place of human death. That's what they were designed to do. They were a terrible picture of sin's consequences. Death entered this world because of the tragedy of Eden, where they disobeyed and they came under penalty of death. Animals die as a reminder of that tragic rebellion of us all against God. The red heifer rectified this defilement, this impurity. They take a little bit of the ashes, sprinkle it in water, dip hyssop in it, and then sprinkle it on you. And it took away that ceremonial uncleanness, that contact with death. It's called a sin offering, but it's not a specific sin. It doesn't say if you did this sin or that sin. It's a sin offering because it's an offering for the original sin, if I don't want to use that word, but that first sin, which caused death to come into the world. So, cleansing from all sin back into the world of life and not death. Well, that's my understanding, at least. That's my disclaimer, but whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. He shall cleanse himself with the water of cleansing, on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and so be clean. And if he does not cleanse himself on the 3rd day and the 7th day, he will not become clean. This wasn't optional. This just wasn't, I want to feel better in God's presence. This was mandatory. If you did not cleanse yourself with this water of cleansing, you were cut off from Israel. Contact with a dead body made you unclean for 7 days. Don't know what that really means. Maybe you wait for the 7 days to pass, like the clock resetting for the 7 days of creation. I don't know what all that means. But it took 2 washings, one on the 3rd day. Well, as Christians, we think about the resurrection of Christ, overcoming death, living on the 3rd day, and then again on the 7th day. Don't know what to make of all of that. But the penalty is being cut off. Verse 20 repeats that same warning. We'll pick up in 13. Whoever touches a dead person, the body of anyone who has died, and does not cleanse himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. And that person shall be cut off from Israel, because the water for impurity was not thrown on him. He shall be unclean. His uncleanness is still on him. This statute for cleansing was for strangers. If you were an Edomite but living in Israel, you had to be cleansed in the same way, or be cast out. We think of baptism, the water of cleansing. That may not be too far a stretch. Touch with that water of cleansing and the penalty of death. And they treated that ceremonial washing as if they're touching toxic waste. I thought I had the verse on the screen. I don't. Here's what it reads, verse 21. This will be a statute forever. The one who sprinkles the water for impurity shall wash his clothes, and the one who touches the water for impurity shall be unclean until evening. And whatever the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and anyone who touches it shall be unclean until evening. Just like the guy who oversaw the sacrifice, the man who did the sacrifice, the guy who collected the ashes, they were all somehow made unclean until evening. So everyone who did the purification ceremony, they were all unclean until evening. Odd to our way of thinking, odd circumstances and situations, but it's as if somehow the whole idea of death had been placed into that red heifer, and it had died, and in its death it could bring life back, but the contamination was there. Okay. The message, death is terrible, it's offensive to God. Jehovah God is life and light. John 1:4, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. God wants us to be free from death. He wants us to be pure from the penalty of death. And that message was taught by this water of cleansing. And the New Testament also talks about this water of cleansing. And let's look at a couple of verses here. Hebrews 13 tells us that for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate. That is, like the red heifer, he was sacrificed on a cross outside the city limits. They did not execute people within the city limits of Jerusalem. He suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. What an image here. Like the red heifer, Jesus was a unique sacrifice. He had never been under the yoke of sin. He was pure without a single variation, no flaw. His death, like the red heifer's death, was for everyone, Jew and Israelite alike. And Jesus' death cleanses those it touches from the contamination, the insult, the defilement of death. Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. He is the living one in Revelation chapter 1. So that's sort of the meaning of the red heifer. It's a picture of Jesus, the sacrifice he's going to give to free us from the penalty of death. If you read the internet, you'll see a lot of people talking about the red heifer and people trying to breed red heifers. Some guys in Texas claim that they have bred 3 red heifers with no white hairs. I've always wondered, number one, you know how expensive a red heifer would be. And number two, what would keep you from taking your tweezers out there and making sure there were no errant hairs on this animal? But assuming everything's on the up and up, they see that as the first step towards the reinstitution of ancient Judaism and the sacrifices and rebuilding the temple and all these kind of things. I don't think there's New Testament grounds for arguing any of that. I think Jesus fulfills that complete meaning of the red heifer in his death and the water that brings life. We got just a few minutes for the second image we see. In chapter 21, they defeated one chieftain, had a few cities under his control. He ran out and captured some Israelites, and they prayed. Because when you captured people were a valuable commodity to be sold as slaves. So Israelite leaders and people alike, they pray, give us victory and we will destroy these evil people. So God gives them victory, they destroy them. Then they make their way south through the desert again around to Edom to begin entering the land of Canaan. But they have to go through the desert. And in the desert, it gets tough again. So pick up in verse 4 of chapter 21. From Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea, and the people became impatient on the way, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. Second generation threatened to fulfill the same crimes, I guess, that their parents did. They were complaining again. Some of these complaints were warranted. It was tough in the desert, which really the Negev at that time was more like a savanna, the experts say, than just rocks and sand. They say there's no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Wait a minute, you just said there's no food. Then they said, but we hate this food. We don't have anything to eat, but we hate what we have to eat. So they had food, it was not appetizing to them. It's easy to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. They were on the verge of doing that very thing. As God did before, he sent suffering upon them in various ways, as we saw in those opening chapters. This time it is something called fiery serpents. The Septuagint called them deadly serpents. The Vulgate called them burning serpents. What was it? Some people say a cobra. Some say a kind of venomous snake that lived in the area. They're kind of small, like small rattlesnakes or something. There's a kind of venomous snake that lives in that area that climbs up in trees. And to stay off the hot sand, it will kind of leap out of one tree to the next tree or leap out of a tree onto the ground. So they could actually jump onto you and bite you. There's the stuff of nightmares, isn't it? You go out to pick dates and a snake jumps you from somewhere. Terrible thing. Somebody suggested guinea worms, which they would get in your feet. They would stay in you for a year, and they would burrow their way out of your skin. And they looked kind of like snakes coming out of you, and they were terribly painful. Who knows? They're deadly. That's all we need to know. Second generation did better. They say, we have sinned. We've spoken against the Lord. They admitted what they had done. And against you, pray to the Lord that he'll take the serpents from us. So that's a much better response. Confession, repentance. So Moses prays and God sends relief. The relief is weird. Look at verse 8. And the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. And everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. It's an odd image. As Christians, we see this serpent upon the pole, and our imaginations go to Christ, who was lifted up. And in fact, Jesus himself said, "And I, when I am lifted up, will draw all men to myself." So I think they had to look at the serpent, which was the source of their suffering. And when they looked at that, they had to admit their own guilt in causing that plague of serpents. Had to see the cause of their suffering and their responsibility. And if they looked on that, they would be healed. It's interesting. It's a lesson for us. What's the solution? To look to the thing, look to the one that God has lifted up. They messed up. God had the solution. He didn't say, get out there and start killing serpents. He didn't say, start making incisions and sucking the venom out of people who are bitten. He didn't say, you need to go try to solve this. He didn't make the serpents go away. He said, look to what I've provided, and you will be saved. And that's, in fact, what they did. That's a lesson in faith, isn't it? I'm sure there had to be some skeptical Israelites who said, that's stupid. A snake bit me, and if I just look up here at this bronze serpent, I'm going to be healed. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else. Bring me the ointment. That didn't work. It's a lesson in faith for us. Sometimes we can't fix everything. We have to acknowledge it, like they had to acknowledge the snake. We have to look to the thing, the one, the Son that God provided, and let Him provide the salvation. That's what we have to do. I see people gathering. I think our time's about up, so we'll stop with that. But Jesus said in John 12:32, He says, When I am lifted up from the earth, Jesus says, I will draw all people to myself. And He said this to show by what kind of death He was going to die. He was lifted up for our healing. He was the red heifer for our cleansing. And so they saw these glimpses of great Christian truths there in the desert. We'll pick up next week. Thanks.